Banjil, Dial, Jada, Yalaguli, Nyaramba, Garani Gulu, Bolamba, Jane Gnu Gulu, Bolamba Baman, Jabaganji, Yiraganji Jada, Guri. Ladies and gentlemen, today I speak on this country. This country belongs to the traditional owners, the Jabagai and the Yiraganji. Thank you. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to forward that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people listening today. I'd also like to take this opportunity to warn any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people in the audience today that this presentation contains images and names of deceased persons, and the content may cause distress. The content of my talk today comes from the findings of my PhD research, which identified 3 forms of violence that are experienced by Indigenous Australians in the criminal justice system, as well as the unequal relations of power that contribute to that violence. Over the next 30 or so minutes, you will hear how pervasive issues of power, violence and authority were found to have contributed, in some part, to in-custody deaths and violence experienced by Indigenous Australians in the criminal justice system. I will start by providing a brief overview of power, violence and authority. Then, drawing on my participants' accounts of their experiences in the criminal justice system, as well as drawing on the analysis of 2 deaths in custody, I will impart the brutal consequences of power and authority exerted by some police, whom I refer to as Necro-enforcers, because they enforce the state's laws that subjugate the lives of Indigenous Australians to the power of death, and prison employees, whom I refer to as death producers, because they instigate the social, political, cultural, and at times physical death of Indigenous Australians behind prison walls. So what is power? According to Felix Oppenheim, power is to be able to subject others to one's control or to limit their freedom. In other words, the capacity to punish or to restrain. When one party, or more, has a degree of power over another, it becomes a relation of power. However, not all parties will control the same thing, nor will they all have the same degree of control. This causes a relation of power where one party initiates actions that aim to control the behaviour of other parties. It also initiates the oppressed party's resistance to this exercise of power. Therefore, relations of power are predicated on the ever-present possibility of resistance. Unequal relations of power have existed in Australia since 1788, and actions of control have been met with ever-present resistance, as declared by Mick Dodson, who said, "We have always resisted, and in many different ways." Sovereignty, after all, is about power and authority. Power, however, warns Soyinka Arabelli, tends to mutate towards decay, abuse and violence. Indeed, when looking towards post-colonial countries, one only has to cite the names of the dead to recall the long history of deadly police racial profiling, to behold the expression of power in the violence it inflicts. According to Arendt, there is nothing more common than the combination of violence and power. The power of the state lies not only in its ability to enact violence, but in its ability to commit or facilitate violence without repercussions. And that the more power a state has, the greater its capacity to commit or facilitate greater acts of violence. Van Manen argues that unequal relations of power between minority groups such as Indigenous Australians and African Americans have emerged as a response by the criminal justice system to being perpetually engaged in a struggle with those who would disobey, disrupt, do harm, agitate, or otherwise upset the just social order. In other words, a struggle against those who would defy the legitimate authority of the criminal justice system. Legitimacy and the authority to wield power are intimately connected notions, with legitimacy now an established concept in criminological analysis, particularly with respect to policing. Power and its use is legitimised when it is acknowledged as rightful by power holders and their staff, as well as third parties whose recognition confirms it as legitimate. Therefore, legitimate power is not only recognised as valid by powerful people, but also by the powerless. Politically speaking, legitimacy is the right to exercise power, or as Tankibi puts it, the belief that legal authorities are entitled to be obeyed, and that the individual ought to defer to their judgments. Power holders, such as criminal justice employees, are given a place of prestige because they are authorised in a manner that ordinary subjects are not to exercise powers and privileges of their positions. These power holders have persuaded themselves that their fates are rightful and deserved. Thus, they have developed a form of self-legitimacy, which they recognise to be their individual entitlement to power. Officers that display these traits truly believe that adherence to the norms that they espouse is a necessity for a decent society to survive. Therefore, some criminal justice employees believe that they have the self-legitimated right to decide who constitutes a decent society, because they believe that their positions within the criminal justice system give them a legitimate superiority over ordinary people, ordaining them with an almost godlike ultimate authority that I call deific authority. This supremacy, this condition in which some criminal justice employees believe that they are superior to all others, specifically Indigenous Australians, can be viewed in the tendency for criminal justice employees to classify members of the public into different subgroups, defined by subjective and situational attributes. This classification then determines the levels of service and attention they deserve, and the levels of violence they may be subjected to. Violence and displays of force are sadly common occurrence for Indigenous Australians, not least in terms of the frontier violence, but also in terms of racist organisations such as the Ku Klux Klan. While the intimidatory practices of the Ku Klux Klan may have become more covert in their operations in Australia, the fear and intimidation tactics have not diminished in the realm of the police service, with complaints of police harassment, intimidation and violence continuing to be heard. Using pseudonyms, I will now draw on my participants' accounts to share with you some of the brutal consequences of power and authority being exerted by necro-enforcers, by the police. Mike was never bashed by the police, but he said, "A lot of my mates were brutally bashed by the police," before he added, "There was a lot of police officers that I believe were in the wrong positions." Steve explained that one time he was riled up and blind drunk. "I didn't know what I was doing." So he says, "The police officers ended up flogging me." The officer in charge of the station came to see him, which Steve described. "I remember him he made the decision to send me to the hospital, because I remember him saying, 'Oh, here he is, here,' and he's lifted up my head, and he's looking, and he's like, 'He needs stitches. I can drop him off at the hospital.'" Steve was indeed dropped off at the hospital, albeit outside the hospital doors. No charges were ever laid against Steve. He added, "I didn't say anything, and they didn't say anything, and that's how it happens." This incident occurred in Mildura in Victoria, but Steve has also been assaulted by the police on the Gold Coast as well. Liam's intersection of indigeneity and motorcycle club member meant that his interaction with the police has been extensive and quite often confrontational. He described one incident in southeast Queensland where the police came across him asleep in a stolen car. On being woken up by an officer banging his torch on the window, Liam took off in a car, but when the tires blew, he jumped out and ran. He told a story of what happened when the officers caught up with him. "They put me on the ground where one was choking me on the ground, and I got up, and I remember him getting out his stick, and he fully busted both my shins. I had jeans on, and there was just blood coming down my leg like that, and I've hit the ground, and he was still hitting me. And then his mate come out of nowhere and dived on me, and he choked me that much, and obviously my heart was going flat out because I've been running and that. He was choking me on the ground. When we get back to the car, he slammed my head against the back of the car." For Joe, one of my younger participants, he said, "I was getting rough-handled at a young age," which he said fell on deaf ears. He explained, "You try and explain that to your caseworkers and that, the youth justice mob, but there's nothing done, you know." Joe recalled that he was once hit by a torch. He showed me the prominent scar on his head. And when asked what help he received, he said, "They just made me wait till it was dry, you know. Big split." Joe described what was going through his mind as this was happening. "I was scared. I said, I'm going to die here. They're going to kill me. The racism, you know. All them things. Something needs to be done about the police and what they're doing. You talk to that bully's boss, and he still don't do nothing. Can you tell one of your workers, and he still pin you, pin you, pin you, pin you." Achilles Mbembe describes death worlds as places where specific populations are subjected to conditions of life, conferring upon them the status of the living dead, where they're alive, but socially, politically, and I would argue culturally dead. Therefore, not only can prisons be ascribed the classification of death worlds, but those that work them can be ascribed the classification of death producers. It is the task of the officers to maintain order in the prison, and as recently as the 1970s, this was done through the systemic use of brutal physical force to ensure that prison routine was observed. However, Cianci posits that equal distribution of power within a prison stems from the consent of the actors and legitimate exercise of prison authority. In other words, if the prisoners view the prison authority as fair, then they will deem it legitimate, which comes not only from the system itself, but also how prisoners are treated by prison officers. This view of legitimate power is also supported by Woolridge and Steiner, who suggest that the perceptions of legitimate power are positive, then it will promote order and safety in the inmate population, because they're more likely to be compliant. When power is not viewed as legitimate, it can lead to non-compliance, which in turn leads to prison officers to revert to coercion and force to assert their authority and legitimacy, which in turn further weakens the position of the officers and their claim to a right to rule. This then turns into a struggle to maintain power and control, with the outcome being types of violence being perpetrated against the prisoners. Interestingly, although Steve spoke of violence against inmates by the prison guards, he also inadvertently supported the theory that the balance of power in prisons is due to the relationships that the guards maintain with inmates. He said of the guards, "It's funny, the guards, it was like an unwritten rule where you got to meet them halfway. If they treat us good, we'll behave pretty much. And the long-timers, the way they talk to guards is like they're talking to a mate, because they've been there for that long. They actually know each other personally." Again, using my participants' accounts, I will now share with you some of the brutal consequences of power and authority being exerted by the death producers. Steve spent prison sentences in different prisons, one in New South Wales and one in Queensland. He described the New South Wales prison of Grafton as being worse than the prison in Rockhampton, Queensland, primarily due to what he described as occasional scuffles between guards and prisoners, with the prisoners, he said, getting flogged, or a couple of hits just to put him down. Liam, who at 49 had spent more than 26 years in prison at the time I interviewed him. He described Brisbane Correctional Centre as being real military because it is government run, and he said he had so many bad things happen there. Liam spoke of physical violence at the hands of prison officers while he was there. One incident was due to a disagreement he had with the person he referred to as the prison manager over a haircut he gave a fellow prisoner because it was considered to be a gang-related style. The prison manager then ordered everyone in the unit out into the yard, and Liam recalled that within minutes the yard was filled with a squad of prison officers with dogs and almost turned it into a riot situation. Liam remembered the manager coming down and yelling, "Where's Johnson? Where's Johnson?" Then he said, "Suddenly there was 2 dogs behind me. I could just feel them breathing on the back of my legs, like boom." After he had been cuffed, the officer said to Liam, "Go on, Johnson, make a move." To which Liam replied, "I'm not doing nothing." But the officer kicked his legs from beneath him anyway. He then described what happened next. "So they put these big zip ties around, and I was kneeled on the ground, head against the wall, so face down, and they kept coming over and saying, "Go on, fucking make a move, Johnson, and wait for you to do something." And then 50 minutes later, woof, off the ground again by the wrists, where they're literally dragging you. They are dragging you backwards, so you're dragging your knees or your toes along the ground. Prisoners are viewed as vulnerable people who require special duty of care, and this includes protecting them from their own acts of self-harm and from assaults by fellow prisoners. Steve was the only participant that spoke of inmate-on-inmate violence. He said every 3 days there'd be a fight, but usually it'd be a fight between two inmates. He said that prisoners would use anything they could use as an improvised weapon. He said mop buckets, they were used a fair bit, and they were pretty heavy. You could fill them up with water, like they can do damage. He added, some guys, they're having a disagreement, they got books in their shorts, so that they can't get stabbed. Before adding nonchalantly, you don't see too many knives because no one wants to show that they've got one. So mop buckets and fists usually. With respect to this inmate-on-inmate violence, Steve said, it's pretty full on, so you sort of expect a fight at any moment, or for yourself, to protect yourself. So it doesn't become a matter of will I fight, it's when, because you gotta if you want to survive. Even if you fight and lose, you still get respect for that. If you fight and cover yourself on the ground like a girl, and that's the way they will look at it, that's not acceptable. So then you're going to make things difficult for yourself. So it's just a different world. According to Joe, fights break out over basic necessities such as bread, tea and milk. He says, you got to start from S2. S2 is the one that you come in, the reception. It's filthy. It's the filthiest unit. Hardly no sugar, milk, tea bags. If you sort of fuck up, you stay in Unit 2 for 2, 3, 4, 6 months. That's why they put people in S2, because there's not much bread in that. People fight. Fight and fight. That's all they do. These accounts of encounters with necro-enforcers and death producers demonstrate the unequal relations of power between Indigenous Australians and the criminal justice system. Whether it's power over somebody, over something, or over resources, or the power to look the other way, they support the argument stated earlier that power tends to mutate towards abuse and violence. The ultimate consequence of this mutation towards abuse and violence is, of course, death. Since Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody in 1991, there have been more than 400 Indigenous deaths in custody, and during the period 2010 to 2019, Indigenous Australians were 7.8 times more likely to die in custody than non-Indigenous Australians. It is important to point out here that Indigenous Australians constitute approximately 2.9% of the overall Australian population. When looking at statistics regarding Indigenous deaths in custody, it is poignant to reflect upon the words of Stan Grant, who in his book Talking to My Country states, to criminologists, these are statistics. To us, they are mothers, fathers, uncles and aunties, brothers and sisters, sons and daughters. These numbers have names and faces. With this in mind, I will now detail the ultimate consequences of power and authority experienced by two Indigenous Australians through the results of the analysis of the coroner's reports into their tragic deaths. Mr. Dumaji was a 36-year-old father of one who is described as having had a positive outlook on life, and who was proud to provide for his family and friends by his skills as a fisherman and a hunter. At around 10:20 a.m. on the 19th of November 2004, Mr. Dumaji was arrested for being a public nuisance because he had deemed to question police behaviour towards another Indigenous man. Senior Sergeant Hurley had not heard the interaction between Mr. Dumaji and the police liaison officer, but upon asking the police liaison officer what had occurred between the two of them, Hurley's response was that he would lock him up. The only other incident that occurred to incite Mr. Dumaji's arrest was that he turned and swore at the police officers. It is important to note that Mr. Dumaji was not a troublemaker, and had never been arrested on the island on which he had lived. At this point, Hurley could have used his discretion and allowed Mr. Dumagy to continue on his way and overlooked this minor incident. However, Hurley immediately drove to Mr. Dumagy and exercised his power of arrest. The coroner noted that although the arrest itself was not unlawful, she did say that it was completely unjustified to decide to arrest, particularly if that decision was solely influenced by a desire to check the computer for outstanding warrants. This is not a basis for arrest. Furthermore, she added that discretion could have been used because Mr. Dumagy had walked away and was clearly not impeding anyone. Therefore, there was always the discretion to do nothing or simply speak with Mr. Dumagy. The exercise of the power to arrest over the use of discretion by Hurley saw Mr. Dumagy taken to the police station with tragic consequences. By 11 a.m, Mr. Dumagy was dead as a result of his liver being virtually completely ruptured, cleaved in two. At the police watchhouse, Mr. Dumagy argued with Hurley and struck out at him, catching him on the jaw. Hurley was clearly surprised at this action, which was inconsistent of his experience of the response from the islanders to his authority. It was reported that Hurley responded by hitting Mr. Dumagy in the side in the vicinity of his ribs. It was also reported that following this, Mr. Dumagy fell silent and was then hauled into the police station with his feet dragging. As Hurley was dragging Mr. Dumagy into the police station, they fell through the door together, where a witness stated that he saw Hurley bending over Mr. Dumagy with his elbow going up and down 3 times, saying, "Do you want more, Mr. Dumagy? Do you want more?" Following this, Mr. Dumagy was dragged 10 to 12 metres down the hallway with Hurley on one side and another officer on the other, and both have dragged him by his wrists with his legs dragging. Mr. Dumagy's injuries, according to the expert pathologist's autopsy results, were more commonly found in people who suffered a high-speed vehicle accident, plane crash, or skiing accident involving a collision with a tree. However, the state's Director of Public Prosecution found no evidence of police mismanagement and stated that Mr. Dumagy's death was accidental. The suggestion in the director's statement is that Mr. Dumagy simply tripped and fell, and in doing so broke his ribs and cleaved his own liver in two, exonerating Hurley. In making the decision to arrest Mr. Dumagy, Hurley exerted necro-power by imposing his will and control that saw Mr. Dumagy's life subjected to the power of short social death in the short term and physical death in the long term. Further, by exerting his power over Mr. Dumagy, Hurley not only inflicted symbolic violence that is reflected in the asymmetric relations of power between himself and Mr. Dumagy, but also exposed Hurley's sense of deific authority. This is particularly emphasised by Hurley's position as the most senior officer on the small island, where he was, according to the coroner, viewed as the ultimate figure of power and authority. The coroner also felt that Hurley felt the need to exert his authority in response to Mr. Dumagy's resistance to that authority. Ms. Inglis was a 37-year-old woman who loved art and music and who was very close to her son. Ms. Inglis had some experiences in her life that were traumatic and left her suffering from depression. She was found unconscious in her prison cell with self-inflicted wounds. Sadly, attempts at resuscitation were unsuccessful. In the prison setting, prisoners are viewed as vulnerable people who require a special duty of care that requires protecting prisoners from their own acts of self-harm and from assaults by fellow prisoners. It must be noted that in prison setting, duty of care does not fall on prison officers alone, but also to the medical and mental health staff. On admission to prison, Ms. Inglis had a complex medical and psychiatric history, including suicidal ideation, depression, and chronic pain. Her chronic pain was the result of a car crash that left her with severe injuries. The prison doctor that treated Ms. Inglis viewed her pain as neuropathic in order. The coroner explained that this meant that the doctor did not believe that Ms. Inglis had chronic or severe pain and that she was merely hunting more Panadine Fort. This was despite Mrs. Inglis's community doctor confirming that she had been prescribed Panadine Forte prior to her incarceration. It can be argued that Miss Inglis sustained systemic violence as a result of the doctor treating her as if she were, in the words of Ruggiero, a human remnant or useless residue. This resonates with the unequal relations of power that led this doctor to develop a sense of deific authority. This was echoed in a medication request form that Miss Inglis had completed, in which she wrote, "I have been patient. You've got the faxes from the doctors in Cairns. I am in constant pain. I don't ever have heavy painkillers, but due to the breaks I have got, I need painkillers to have a decent sleep. I have been patient, and now you have gone through the process. I am still suffering for no reason." The power and authority that the doctor held over Miss Inglis as an incarcerated person were highlighted by Matilda Alexander of the Prisoner Legal Service, who said, "If you're in the outside community, you could just go to another doctor, get a second opinion. You could access those health records yourself and prove that you were actually in that much pain. But for someone who is in prison, their means of seeking a second opinion and their means of being believed is drastically reduced." Finally, the coroner noted that it is impossible to know the extent to which insufficient analgesia and the resulting sleep deprivation contributed to Miss Inglis's decision to end her life, but they were probably factors. The findings of my research, albeit limited, show indications that unchecked power and authority lead to actions, or in some cases inaction, by some criminal justice employees that exemplifies their belief that they are superior to Indigenous Australians, which has resulted in brutal consequences. Further studies in the sense of deific authority felt by criminal justice employees in terms of both self-legitimacy and supremacy, superiority are highly recommended. The findings of this study could make the basis for a postdoctoral or fellowship study. I'll finish on this point regarding research relevance, responsiveness and impact, due to the fact that this is a Social Science Week presentation. While considering these 3 points in respect to my own research, I was reminded that research does not exist in a vacuum, and for Indigenous Australian people, it is beset by historical, political and ethical barriers in terms of creating perceptible benefits. Therefore, researchers, particularly non-Indigenous ones such as myself, must work hard to ensure their research is relevant and responsive to the desires and the requirements of Indigenous Australian people, as well as actively striving for a positive impact while limiting the negative. Thank you very much for your time today.